Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to my talk about modernizing with Symfony. I hope you enjoyed the conference so far. So, short introduction about me. My name is Alexander Turek. I'm a freelance software developer building web applications with PHP. I obviously like moving a lot, and I like the Symfony framework, and I also like digging deep into old legacy code. And how those last 2 points fit together, this is mainly the topic of this talk. So if we take a typical Symfony application, then it probably somehow looks like this. I have a front controller, a couple of controllers below that, a service layer, and then there's a HTTP request coming in. It's delegated to a controller. This controller uses a couple of services, and one of the services, for instance, might be an SQL database. And then eventually an HTTP response is getting sent back to the client. So I've basically have 2 extension points here. I have on the one hand the router where I can insert simply new routes to my application, and I have a service container where I can add more functionality that can be shared among multiple controllers. If I take a look at a legacy application, then it's, first of all, it's some old code blob where an HTTP request is coming in, some magic is happening, something is happening on the database, and there's a response coming out of it. So this application might have had some kind of architecture, but the knowledge about it got lost over time, and then it's got patched here and patched there and patched everywhere, and suddenly nobody understands how this application works. So what happens then is that first people demand a rewrite. We should simply scrap this and replace it with a new modern application. But if you do this, then you probably end up with a rewrite that never finishes. So why do I think that Symfony is the right framework to solve that problem? Because first of all, it's a modern application framework. It's the kind of framework that represents the way I want to develop PHP applications today. And it's also highly extensible. So I have a lot of extension points in there to make my legacy application work with my new application together. So the first approach that I want to talk about is what I call Symfony before legacy. So I have my front controller that receives all the requests, and then this front controller tries to serve that request with my Symfony application, and if it fails to do that, then it tries to fulfill the request with my legacy application. And this gets me into a nice position, because once I try to fulfill this request with a Symfony application, I have a fully booted kernel lying there in global scope, and I can access parts of my Symfony application within my legacy application. So if I take a look at a typical very old legacy application, then well, one would say there's no such thing as a routing in there, but in fact, routing is done via the web server itself. So I have probably a couple of PHP scripts that might be called directly, and then the web server decides which of the scripts should be called, and within those scripts I probably have some kind of framework, because there's some common lib or something included in there. But first of all, what we would consider to be controllers in a Symfony application would be those directly callable PHP scripts in the legacy application. So what I'm doing there is I first of all catch all the requests with mod rewrite or whatever the web server of your choice offers you. If you take this mod rewrite configuration here, then it kind of looks like the one that you find inside the Symfony standard distribution. I just made some slight modifications to it. So what it basically says is pick every request and if it's not a real file-on-file system, then serve it with the front controller, otherwise directly serve that file. I've added another exception to this, saying if it's an actual file but it isn't a PHP file, then also use the front controller for this. And to avoid an endless loop, I've added a rule that if the file that has been called is the front controller, then please call it directly, so that the front controller is not delegated to itself. The problem with that is that certain global settings won't fit anymore if I do this, like the PHP self or script name or script file name settings. So I have to change those so my legacy application doesn't notice that there's something in front of it. And doing this with PHP self and script name and script file name is fairly easy because you simply have to point it to the script that it was actually called. What is more difficult is this path info. If you have to emulate this, then yeah, you have to rewrite the URL that came in. So path info, if you're not familiar with that, this is, you could basically call a PHP script and then append a path to it, and this path is what is the path info then. And the front controller from Symfony does the same trick, but if I look at in the path info, then in the path info inside my new front controller, then the legacy script is already part of that path info, so I have to strip it out. And the other thing is that I have to change the directory into the directory into the location of the actual legacy script. So this is basically how a front controller would look like if we do this. I take the request and then I try to serve it with a typical Symfony kernel. And after that, I have something called a legacy bridge, which is something that is very specific to your application. And this legacy bridge decides if the response coming from your Symfony application should be served directly, or if I should instead call some legacy script. And then in case a script is returned, I simply require that script. Otherwise, I send the response. Why do I have to do this requiring in the front controller? The thing is, if you would do the require inside some kind of function call, like inside this legacy bridge, then the script would not be executed in the global variable scope. So if your legacy application relies heavily on global variables, or on the fact that registering a variable makes it global by default, and then some function wants to grab that from the global scope, then your application will probably fail if you do the require within a method call. This is why I do this in the front controller. So this is basically an approach that works for any legacy application. I will later on show a couple of other approaches that make certain assumptions about your legacy applications, like the usage of global variables, which are a bit more convenient than this, but you cannot apply them every time. So this is the approach that should work every time. So what this simple trick enables me to do is I can use services from the Symfony application and simply directly access them from inside my legacy application. So I can perform simple refactoring steps like this one. What you see here is a pattern that I find in legacy applications quite often. Like there is some configuration lying in global scope where you have the database connection data or connection settings, then direct MySQL connect is done. We are cycling the database, and then we're running a direct query on the database. And you can now easily refactor this into getting, for instance, the Doctrine connection from your Symfony application and run the query on Doctrine dbar. in this case, we probably also fixed an SQL injection that might be in there. So the first thing that I would want to have inside my Symfony application then would be an authentication, because Symfony has to recognize somehow that a user is logged onto your application. And you could now say, okay, now we are replacing the whole legacy application authentication with a standard Symfony one, but this is probably a larger refactoring project if you do this. So you can split your authentication probably into two parts. The first thing is that a user wants to authenticate with your system. This is, in many applications, the harder part, because what I often find there is that it's not simply a username and a password that are checked against the database and then the user is logged in. This would be fairly easy. But then there's some logic that the user has to be looked up in some LDAP server, and if the user is there, then pick this one, and if he's not there, then maybe look up in another service over there, and if he's there, then pick this one, and so on. And this logic probably grew over time, over a time period of like 10 years or so, so it's probably very complicated and complex, and you do not simply want to replace it all at once just to be able to use Symfony. So the other aspect of authentication, the one that is more easily implemented, is authenticating single HTTP requests and linking it to a user. If a user logs into your system, then probably the legacy application does something like this. It takes the PHP session, and the username is simply written to this PHP session, or maybe some other user data as well. And on every subsequent request, your legacy application looks into the session, and if there is a username in the session, then it assumes this user to be logged in, and the request is authenticated. And we can do the very same trick if we simply implement a small God authenticator for Symfony that looks into the PHP session and just simply looks into the session and tries to find a username there. And if there is a username, we are loading it and logging in that user. So the request is authenticated. This enables us to do authenticated requests against our Symfony application without implementing this whole bunch of how should a user, when he logs in, be authenticated with the system behind it. Of course, eventually you want to have the authentication completely migrated into the Symfony application, but this does not necessarily have to be your first step. So now, if we have an authenticated request against the Symfony application, then we would probably think that maybe we want to use the authentication in our legacy application as well, so we can move all logic of detecting authenticated users into the Symfony application and then deprecate the old I'm writing a username into the session behavior. This takes us to a problem, and to explain that problem, I'm taking a slight detour into Symfony's event cycle. I'm explaining this a bit because I've found that many people are using Symfony without really caring about how the events behind that work. If you take the typical request against the Symfony application, then we first have the request event, which simply says, hey, I got a request. Can anybody serve this directly? After that, there's a controller resolver that jumps in that takes attributes that have been set on the request and try to resolve the actual controller that should be loaded. So this is why in this first event here, this is the place where the router resides. So the router takes a request, tries to find a route that is configured, then writes the controller that should be called into the request attributes, and then the controller solver is able to resolve the controller. Then we have the controller event, which could be used to modify the controller that should actually be loaded. Then the arguments are resolved, and then the actual controller is called. And this controller, in most cases, already returns a response, and then we're done. And if it's not returning a response, then there's another event called view, which is well, hardly known, but widely used, because if you know this template annotation, where you are able to simply return an array from your controller and then template is magically rendered, this actually works with this view event. And we're coming back to this later on. But first of all, if you take the kernel request event, and this screenshot is taken from a plain Symfony standard distribution, then those are the priorities that you have. And we can see here that here we have the router that tries to resolve the request. And below here we have the firewall that actually does the authentication. The problem we now have is if we do this Symfony before legacy approach, then the router will already exit because it could not find a route for our legacy script. That means that the firewall will never be called. So requests to our legacy application will still be seen as unauthenticated for Symfony because our router says no. So what we can do to get around this is making the legacy routes also known to the router, but not attaching a controller to it. You can do this by having like a catch-all route at the very bottom of your routing configuration, or you can also do this with a service that simply emits all the routes. That scans the file system for any PHP files and throws routes for it into the router configuration. And what then happens is that not the router is exiting, but the controller resolver, and the controller resolver kicks in after the firewall. One could think that this is pretty slow to scan the whole file system to find all the routes, but this is only done once on cache warmup, because the router is compiled and written to disk, and once the cache is warmed up, this will never be called again. So you simply use it to compile your router. The only place where this doesn't work, and I've actually had a project where this was the case, is when your application on runtime writes PHP script to disks and then expects them that they could be called directly afterwards. This is, of course, something you should never do. But yeah, there are also such self-rewriting legacy monsters out there, and in those cases, this approach would fail because it would generate scripts that are not known to the router. So calls to those generated scripts then will be unauthenticated again. So the only way you can catch those is if you really have a catch-all route, which is, well, not something I would always recommend, but if you want those generated scripts to be authenticated, you have to do this. So what this small step allows us to do then is that we can refactor all code that does authorization logic with the requests into direct calls to the service container, or the authorization checker of Symfony. So I can now model my permission model or my authorization model inside Symfony, access it from the legacy application as well, and eventually, if I refactored all the places where the legacy authorization was used, then I could deprecate the legacy way of doing authorization, and Symfony would be our leading system then for authenticated requests and for authorization of certain actions. So The next approach I want to talk is wrapping the legacy application into a controller. So if my application is already structured in a way that all logic is split into certain global functions, for instance, with very little use of global variables, then you can do this. And this also plays well with this approach of generating the legacy routes, because the router then is able to simply write the script that should be called into the attributes, and this controller here can simply grab those information from the method parameters. So what you then have is that every request goes directly through Symfony. You don't have to catch this a 404 in your front controller anymore. And yeah, this is probably a more integrated way to do this. But as I said, this does not work if your legacy application relies heavily on global variables. If you just have a small set of global variables that need to be there so your legacy script works, then you can emulate those global variables here if you know which ones to emulate. But if you don't know this, then probably this approach would not work. The next thing I would want to show you is wrapping existing controllers. So if your legacy application was already written with some kind of MVC-like framework, and you have some kind of controller structure already, then it might be that you could use those controllers directly. So one example I want to show you is one that I found in a project where there was some RPC mechanism implemented. It worked in a way that there was some like global script that was called directly with a post request, and inside the post body we would find a reference to a PHP class and to a method that should be called, and an array of parameters that should be passed to this class. Of course, there was some whitelisting mechanism, so the frontend was not able to call arbitrary PHP classes, but for now this would not matter. So just for this example, we assume that this post request here would be mapped to a controller that would look like this. So yeah, if the class is mapped here, this matches the public function, and then we have two parameters that would be inserted here. And this is actually pretty easy to wrap into a Symfony application, because we can implement a custom request matcher that passes this request and then simply writes the class and the method that should be called into this underscore controller parameter or attribute into the request, and also extracts the parameters from the request body and registers them as attributes on your request. The problem then is that your legacy controller will most likely return something that is not a Symfony HTTP Foundation response. So this is where this kernel view event that I've talked earlier about kicks in, because we can now implement a listener on this very event, and here we have a small check that we are on this route for this APC calls, this RPC calls, sorry. And we are simply grabbing the result that was returned from the controller, and then we are converting it into a Symfony response. So what we are now able to do is we can simply take our legacy controllers and call them directly from the Symfony application. Your legacy controllers probably won't notice that the things have changed around it. And you can simply go on using them. So all these approaches allows now to refactor the whole application in two ways. The first way would be to refactor into services. So I take some piece of logic from inside my legacy application. This might be some domain logic, that might be some logic how to access certain external services, that might be some logic that calculates permissions, or yeah, you name it, and refactor this into a service that is inserted into Symfony's service container. And then this piece of logic would be available from inside new controllers, so from inside the new part of my application, as well as, because the kernel resides in global scope and I have access to the container from there, I can also access this refactored piece of logic from non-refactored parts of my application. So if you do this over and over again, then you could see that your standard library of your service layer of the legacy application would eventually become the service layer of your Symfony application. And the other refactoring that we can do is refactor logic into controllers. So I could pick one of those, for instance, legacy scripts that are on the public HTML directory of the web server, or one of my legacy controllers, and refactor it into a Symfony controller, and then plug it into the Symfony routing, and delete the old script. And if I do this over and over again, then of course eventually you have a Symfony application where all your legacy scripts have been migrated into controllers. What you can do here is you can simply register a route that looks exactly like the path to your legacy script, and register this inside your router. Because inside your legacy application, probably links or among the scripts are hard-coded. So if you have some legacy script that has a link to another legacy script, then it probably will have a hard-coded path to something.php, and you probably want this hard-coded path still to work, because otherwise you would have to scan the application for all those links to that script and adjust them. So as long as the new controller is registered onto the same path of your your old script, it would continue to work. And also, if you notice that your new controller doesn't do exactly what the old script did, or it behaves differently, or has some kind of error or mistake in it, then you could simply remove that line from your router configuration, and your Symfony application would then fall back to the old legacy script again. So you still have a switch to switch back to your legacy code. So to sum this up, why I'm doing such an approach, Symfony in this approach is used as the framework for new application parts and for refactored or modernized application parts, and it doesn't force me to do a full rewrite of the whole application simply to have a legacy, to have a modern application. Also, I probably have some kind of or some areas in my application that simply work, that have been working for the last 10 years and also would work for the next 5 years without the need of modifying it. So those parts of your application could remain in the way they are for a longer period of time without the need to actually refactor them into your Symfony application. those approaches allow me to refactor everything in smaller steps and after each step my application would still be executable. I can deploy this refactoring right away and the application should still work. So I can turn off the parts that I've replaced immediately. I don't have to maintain the same way of doing something twice. And I can also do a refactoring before a change. So if I know that a certain part of an application is going to be changed in the near future because there are new requirements to it, or I know or I have a lot of bug reports for this certain part, then I can refactor this into a Symfony controller or into the Symfony, and this might enable me to change this part more easily in the future. And what I'm also doing with this approach is I'm avoiding blocking refactorings. So there's not this big rewrite or big refactoring project that lasts longer than we expected, and new functionality is waiting for this refactoring to be completed. So I can do this in small steps, and if I notice that the refactoring takes too long, or there are more urgent requirements that need to be fulfilled or implemented, then I can simply stop this refactoring and do the feature development. And of course, I'm not ending up with a never-ending rewrite of an application that already works. So I would like to open up this round now for questions, if you have any, because I'm done. Thank you.